Good evening. On behalf of John Jay College of Criminal Justice of the City University of New York and Columbia University's Institute for Latin American Studies, Cuba program, I want to welcome you all, and a special thank you to the people who helped here at John Jay to set this evening up. It's being emitted as a webinar from Columbia University, and we're doing a live, obviously, event here, and it's being videotaped here. So we had a lot of technical coordination to do before we started today. So thank you for your patience, as a matter of fact. And particularly, we want to thank Dan Stageman, Director of Research at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and Remy Bahati of that same office for all of their efforts, as well as Ben Lapidus, who really went beyond and above. And we have our technical guru up at Columbia, Astrid Lydon, who's been working on this for some time. So thanks to Astrid, too. We also have some co-sponsors: the Center for Latin America and Caribbean Studies at New York University, the Cultural Connections, which is an NGO that is not very far from here, that focuses on high school and university students obtaining basic information and all sorts of cultural events for students from around the world. And we also want to thank the Cuba Foundation. But now we're going to get to the meat of the matter, namely an exploration of trends in Cuban music, and including the impact of Cuban musicians and Cuban composers on US music, including jazz, salsa, and a variety of other things. And to explore that very interesting realm, we have tonight two of not only New York's finest, but also the US finest, Christopher Washburne and Ben Lapidus. Chris is a professor of music and chair of the music department at Columbia University and the founder of the Columbia University's Louis Armstrong Jazz Performance Program. He has published numerous articles on jazz, Latin jazz, and salsa. His books include Bad Music, The Music We Love to Hate, Sounding Salsa, Performing Latin Music in New York, and Latin Jazz, The Other Jazz. As a trombonist, he has performed on over 150 records, with 2 of them Grammy winners, and 7 Grammy nominated. He was voted a rising star of the trombone numerous times in the annual Downbeat Critics Poll. He has performed with so many people, I can't name them all. I'll just mention a couple: Tito Puente, Celia Cruz, Eddie Palmieri, Muhal Richard, et cetera, et cetera. And in addition, he has 2 or 3 groups that he directs, one of which is the highly acclaimed Ciotos Latin Jazz Band, and Fear, which is another, and the Rags and Roots Jazz Band. He has a doctorate in ethnomusicology from Columbia University. And if you Google him, you'll find out a lot more. Ben Lapidus is a scholar, educator, composer, arranger, and Grammy-nominated musician who has performed and recorded particularly about the Cuban trace, as well as the Puerto Rican cuatro. He also plays the guitar, teaches voice, and other instruments, and has done film soundtracks and done a lot of Latin music and jazz. Some of the musicians that he's played with are Pio Leiva, Manuel Puntillita Alcea, Bobby Cacases, boy, it's really stretching me tonight, as well as Cachito Lopez, Juan Pablo Torres, etc. And in addition to all of that, he's a professor here at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, as well as the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He teaches popular music of the Caribbean, guitar, world music, and other courses. He has also taught the Cuban trace and guitar in the jazz and contemporary music program at the New School University, and given master classes and workshops on Caribbean music throughout the world. Lapidus served as a scholar in residence for Cuba programs at the Jewish Museum of New York and the New York Center for Jungian Studies from 2004 to 16. He completed his doctorate in ethnomusicology at the CUNY Graduate Center in 2002 and has since published the first ever book on Cuban and Puerto Rican music, particularly focusing on indigenous music in those two countries. In addition, he has a wide range of local and national grants for his research, which helped produce the book in 2021, New York and the International Sound of Latin Music from 1940 to 1990. And I think he has a book come out right now, or a little while ago, no? Soon. Okay, he'll tell you more about it. Okay, we're gonna start with Chris Washburne from Columbia University. Chris.
It's so nice to see some friendly faces that I haven't seen for a while. And thank you so much for coming. And Meg, thanks for the invitation to be here, and Ben for all of the organization. I was asked to give a presentation on the current trends of Cuban music. And I'm going to speak about some of the ideas that came out in my recent book, Latin Jazz, the Other Jazz. But I'm going to start, I think, in a bit of an unconventional way, because I was trying to think to myself, if I have to talk about what are the current trends of Cuban music, I think that this video captures it better than anything else. You may be familiar with this video. You probably would not necessarily associate it with Cuban music, but for those of you that are hip to Cuban music, you might pick up on some things. I'm gonna play it, but I'm gonna stop at some very, I think, important moments that I'll come back to and talk about.
I tried to change. Closed my mouth more. Tried to be softer, prettier, less awake. Fasted for 60 days. Wore white. Abstained from mirrors. Abstained from sex. Slowly did not speak another word. In that time, my hair I grew past my ankles. I slept on a mat on a floor. I swallowed a sword. I levitated. Went to the basement, confessed my sins, and was baptized in a river. Got on my knees and said amen, and said I mean. I whipped my own back and asked for dominion at your feet. I threw myself into a volcano. I drank the blood and drank the wine. I sat alone and begged and bent at the waist for God. I crossed myself and thought I saw the devil. I grew thick in skin on my feet. I bathed in bleach and plugged my menses with pages from the holy book, but still inside me, coiled deep, was the need to know. Are you cheating on me? Are you cheating on me?
Keep that image in your mind for a moment. continue. Pay attention to the percussion accompaniment.
Hold up, they don't love you like I love you. Slow down, they don't love you like I love you. Back up, they don't love you like I love you. Step down, they don't love you like I love
Let me guide your listening.
you. Can't you see there's no other man above you? What a wicked way to treat the girl that loves you. Hold up, they don't love you like I love you. Hold down, they don't love you like I love you. Something don't feel right because it ain't right, especially coming up after midnight. I smell your secrets, and I'm not too perfect to ever feel this worthless. How did it come down to this? Scrolling through your call list. I don't wanna lose my pride, but I'ma fuck me up a bitch. Know that I kept it sexy, and know I kept it fun. There's something that I'm missing, maybe my head for one. What's worst, looking jealous or crazy, jealous or crazy? Or like being walked all over lately, walked all over lately. I'd rather be crazy. Hold up, they don't love you like I love you. Slow down, they don't love you like I love you. Back up, they don't love you like I love you. Step down, they don't love you like I love you. Can't you see there's no other man above you? What a wicked way to treat the girl that loves you. Hold up, they don't love you like I love you. Slow down, they don't love you like I love you. Let's imagine for a moment that you never made a name for yourself, a master wealth. They had you labeled as a king. Never made it out the cage, still out there moving in them streets. Never had the baddest woman in the game up in your sheets. Would they be down to ride now? They used to hide from you, lie to you.
Look at the background.
Child, no, we were made for each other, so I find you and hold you down. Missing, say, hold up, they don't love you like I love you. Slow down, they don't love you like I love you. Back up, they don't love you like I love you. Step down, they don't love you like I love you. Can't you see there's no other man above you? What a wicked way to treat the girl that loves you. Hold up, they don't love you like I love you. Slow down, they don't love you like I love you. It's such a shame you let this good love go to waste. I always keep the top tier, 5-star, sexy loving in the car, like make that wood, highly like a boulevard. What's worse, looking jealous or crazy, jealous and crazy. Or like being walked all over lately, I'd rather be crazy.
Look at the background. I'll stop it there. This is just one of hundreds of videos that I could have started this lecture with. What are the newest trends in Cuban music? They are absolutely at the absolute center of popular music production in the world right now. How did we get here? For those of you unfamiliar with some of the things that I pointed out, what's interesting about Beyonce is she's an historicist. She's a revisionist. She pays very special attention to where the music comes from and the roots, and she makes sure that she pays a tribute to that. The beginning of this video is, hold on, why is this? The beginning of this video is really an initiation, it references initiation rites into spiritual practices, sometimes known as Santeria. They're derived from West African traditions. They're syncretic religions that emerged in the colonial period throughout the Caribbean and Cuba as well, and have been imported into this country. When she emerges from that ceremony, she comes out dressed in gold, beautiful, around water. When she's actually, you can tell that they want to make sure that you understand that we are no longer in just the mundane world, we're in the spiritual realm. Because how does it happen that she uses a baseball bat and then fire explodes? Supernatural powers. Of course, this is reference to a deity known for beauty, Oshun, and is thought to be so beautiful that everybody that lays eyes on her falls in love. She's a deity that you praise to for fertility and for love. and also represents probably a very early feminist perspective of the world. And of course, Beyonce represents that in the popular realm. Just to make sure that you get those references, though, what she does is she undergirds this entire performance with bongos, a West African instrument that's very central in Cuban son traditions and in salsa and mambo and cha-cha and many of the other ones that are, it's so important as an essential sonic marker of Afro-Cuban traditions. The background track is in clave. Clave, the rhythm, the rhythmic organizing principle of Afro-Cuban music. In other words, she has organized all of the musical components around this and around this manifestation of a deity. Of course, this is popular music, and the initiation rites was just to figure out if someone was cheating on her. So it's about love, which is normal, but she's also rooting her practices in this long history, this colonial encounter that we're all implicated in one way or another. But it's also a long legacy of Cuban music being completely centered in popular culture. And it goes way back, we can trace it way back. In my book, the reason why I call Latin jazz the other jazz is because that component of Latin jazz tends to be erased from the historical record. And my book is a revisionist look at the history of jazz. And I trace the birth of it back into the early 1600s. It predates jazz as we know it. But if you want to know more about that, please buy the book and buy it in bulk. But that being said, now the plug's gone, I want to kind of reveal some of the things that I found in the research of my book that explains this. And it also explains Bad Bunny. Like, how is it possible that Bad Bunny can be on the top of the Billboard 200 charts with songs that are in Spanish, and they're the #1 songs in the United States? Truly remarkable. Not really. It's happened before. History repeats itself. It's wonderful that it happened, no matter what you think of Bad Bunny. But we could also look at the music of Mark Anthony. His song, Need to Know, as a guajira, and played with violins. It's a charanga, and it's popular music. It's on all sorts of AM radio stations now. It's seeped into all of the cracks and crevices in the United States. Our pop stars today are playing Cuban music. Now let me get my PowerPoint that disappeared up, so we can look at some images. This was an advertisement that I found from the New York Times in 1917. Evan Christopher was the one that helped me find this. It's for a venue that's right near here, Reisenheimer's Columbus Circle. As a matter of fact, it's a building and a club, a music club, that's where Jazz at Lincoln Center is right now. Today, an entire novelty, seance tea dances. There's a medium of gypsies, of dances of the Orient. Gypsy crystal gazers are there. And the original jazz dance and Cuban danson will be played. 1917, Cuban danson played in Midtown. What does that mean? For white people. These were all white venues. If you go, Ouija boards will be provided. In America's most beautiful ballroom, the Paradise Ballroom. And then if you look down at which band was playing the original jazz dance and the dansons, it's the original Dixieland Jazz Band, the very first jazz band from New Orleans to ever be recorded. They were a bunch of white guys that were mimicking the black music styles in New Orleans, very good musicians, And they were central in diffusing jazz and popularizing jazz, especially among white audiences. They never recorded a dance song. They only recorded early jazz pieces, typically derived from the black practices in New Orleans. But when they came to New York City, they were playing dansons. Why? Because dansons was extremely popular amongst New Orleans audiences in the late 1800s and early 1900s. They were playing the popular music of the day, Cuban music, along with a lot of other things, but that was central. It was one of the newest dances. And we start to see that this history, if we look at recorded history throughout the 20th century, time and time again, people turn to the island of Cuba for the newest dance crazes. Many of you know this history, aren't familiar with it. Some of you may not. I was not familiar with the original Dixieland Jazz Band playing dansons. Why? Because the recorded record doesn't have any proof. Because when they went into the recording studio, they didn't want to have a white jazz band playing Cuban music. Even the black bands of the day, when they started to do recording in the early 1920s, rarely played Cuban dansons. But if we can look at that advertisement, we can see that the white audiences were prizing otherness. They were prizing novelty, the exotic. And this music served a purpose because it was the music of the other, and it was very popular. And indeed, we see these practices, if you can think about Josephine Baker in Paris as well, presenting otherness to those audiences. It was something that was in vogue in art circles with primitivism and primitivist art, but it was also a key component for allowing people to have a more worldly experience by experiencing the other. It was what was going on with Duke Ellington in New York City playing at the Cotton Club, staging otherness, staging blackness, staging primitiveness. But these musicians were using these strategies in order to expand their audiences. If Cuban danson was being played in 1917 in New York, it's because it was being played in New Orleans a lot earlier. And we see a lot of the early New Orleans jazz innovators giving a nod to that influence of Cuban music. Jelly Roll Morton, a pianist, a Creole pianist from New Orleans, was famous for talking about the Spanish tinge, to have the appropriate feel in for jazz. What was he referring to? Typically Afro-Cuban rhythms that were inserted into the rhythms of New Orleans. Throughout the colonial period, New Orleans was one of the northernmost Caribbean cities, administered by the Spanish and the French. For those of you who visited New Orleans, the food tastes different, the music sounds different, the people talk differently. It's a different cultural practice that happened there. It's also the place that Congo Square was able to exist and proliferate some of these traditions. It wasn't only Jelly Roll Morton that was talking about a Spanish tinge. And when using Spanish at the time in the 1930s, when he came up with this quote, he was referring to the Spanish-speaking Caribbean cultures and musical cultures. We also see in the next kind of iteration, looking for dance crazes, it was this gentleman that also played in Midtown, not far from here, Don Aspiazo and his Havana Casino Orchestra. He was a band leader that was very popular among the casinos and playing for tourists in the hotels and casinos in Havana. He came up to New York to perform in Spanish Harlem and was heard by the RCA Victor executives in the early 1930s. And they saw someone that they could use, that was familiar with musical translation. If danson was so popular in the 19-teens, what could we get that could replace it in the 1930s? This is the press shot that they set up for Don Aspiazo in 1931. If you can see that, he's a good-looking guy. He also happens to be a light-skinned Cuban, which helped at that point. Not too other, just a little other. Dressed in one of those mambo shirts that I used to have to wear when I played with the Xavier Cugat band, which I leave out of my bio. And so dressed in that kind of traditional son garb, but then also surrounded by aspects of exotica and otherness. We can look now at this picture and you can see that those are just percussion instruments that we're quite accustomed to. But in 1930, they weren't available for sale. It wasn't until the Gretsch company started to mass produce them after the success of bands like Don Aspiazu. Bongos at his feet, timbales, there's a guiro, there's even a jawbone along with maracas, and he's holding a set of claves like they're some Cuban cigars. These are the instruments that made the music sound other. The only thing is that Don Aspiazu's band was totally influenced by the Fletcher Henderson Band, which was the #1 most popular jazz band in the 1920s. Here's a picture of them. It's a little small, but that you can see. Actually, there's saxophones, there's trumpets, trombones, violins, a string bass, piano, all of the type of instruments that you would see in Fletcher Henderson's band. He just mimicked it. The 3 saxophones that doubled, and there's 3 clarinets there as well. And a tuba in the back. But then, of course, and a banjo on the floor. But if you look closer at this, all of those percussion instruments are there as well. Recorded in 1930, I'd like to play, I think a lot of you probably know this song. It was a song that was familiar to audiences in the United States because it had been recorded by Marion Sunshine a few years earlier, and the lyrics had been translated. And it's something called El Manicero, or the Peanut Vendor. So it was very popular amongst audiences. Don Aspiazu came up, and they performed it in Harlem, and the RCA Victor executive said, you know, we know that song. We could bring them to Midtown, and we could play for white audiences as well. And what could happen is we'll have them play this song and some of their other songs, and we'll see how popular it is. Let me just play that song for you so that you get it in your ear. This is a recording from 1930. Maybe with that slightly green tinge, you can see that there's something quite remarkable. That in 1930, these guys were playing in the 50s in Midtown for a bunch of white audiences. You're looking at the first racially integrated band that appeared in New York City on a stage anywhere. This would have been illegal at that time. Now, the jam sessions after hours in Harlem was a different story. They were integrated prior to that, and some of the recording sessions were actually integrated, but not in the white venues. Don Aspiazu was one of the first Cuban band leaders to integrate and use street elements in his band, and so he was really an innovator and on the cutting edge of breaking down these racial barriers. And he brought it to New York, but because New York and the United States at that time had a conception of race of being black and white, When asked about this, he would say, everybody in my band is Cuban. And what do they do with that racial binary when all of a sudden the definition is Cuban as opposed to black or white? He was on the forefront of racial integration, and it started right near here in this neighborhood. At the same time, the song that we just played, the English translation for these lyrics are, a lovely merry maid in Cuba is waiting for her lover to bring her some peanuts. And the peanut vendor is really a son pregón, which is a type of genre that's based off of street vendor calls that Moses Simon wrote in the 1920s while living, and he's a Cuban composer, while living in Spain, writing for a venue of Spanish audiences to present otherness and exotica from the Caribbean. But he brings it here. The only thing is that nobody in that audience understood Spanish, or they took Spanish in high school. Because this song is not about a merry little maid in Cuba waiting for peanuts. I can give you a rough translation. Hey, baby, I got a hot cone of peanuts for you, and you need to eat that every single night. This was an X-rated illicit song. RCA Victor recorded it. They didn't even know what the genre was. They just said they'd heard that rumba was a popular genre in Cuba. They even misspelled rumba and used it as put an H in it, and launched a huge dance craze across the United States and into Europe, which was called the rumba dance craze. It pissed off the Cubans that couldn't believe that this genre was mislabeled. And not only that, they recorded this record and it became the #1 hit record of 1930 and 1931. Within 7 months, Louis Armstrong had recorded it, Duke Ellington had recorded it, Red Nichols had recorded it. It's like the equivalent of a gazillion downloads today. And people complain about reggaeton being X-rated or dancehall. Ain't nothing new. Cuba, #1 hit song. Also, they introduced slack lyrics into the popular realm way before anybody else was doing it. If they had known what it was about, it would have never gotten recorded at that time. Beyonce is just in this tradition. Of course, in the 1930s, the whole notion of West African syncretic religions was not able to be revealed outwardly in a lot of different places in the Caribbean and also in the United States. Until the 1940s. And we start to see other musicians come in and innovate and also become extremely popular. And one great example is Machito. Frank Grillo is the band leader and singer. Mario Balza is his musical director. They launch a band and they call it, in the early 1940s, Machito and his Afro-Cubans. This was extremely revolutionary in the sense that that Afro prefix was actually used in a band's name. What they were doing, though, was just embracing the Afro-Cubanismo of Fernando Ortiz, that idea of looking to the West African roots of Cuban culture and acknowledging it publicly, and using it to define Cuban culture. It is completely in line with the writings that were happening in so many of the nations throughout the Caribbean, and also Marcus Garvey's idea, some of the ideas behind the Harlem Renaissance. Machito and Mario Bauza come to New York City. Mario Bauza first arrives with Don Aspiazu as his trumpet player and walks the streets of Harlem and says, this is such a wonderful place to be, not to experience the kind of racism that I have to experience working in Havana. I want to stay. And he did stay and worked with many of the great jazz bands and was key to kind of combining jazz and Afro-Cuban styles in the Machito band, where many people say this is the birth of Latin jazz, the true birth of Latin jazz. But what they also did is that they played in Harlem for black audiences. So much so, and they were extremely popular. This was another place where black culture in the US come together with Cuban culture. As a matter of fact, at the Apollo Theater, Machito played there more times than the Duke Ellington Orchestra and the Count Basie Orchestra combined. And this was the premier venue for black performance styles. It was the place where black culture, black Harlem came together and to celebrate the greatest acts in the world. And Machito was a regular there. So were many of the other artists that have come to really represent the cutting edge voices of Latin music in New York City. Eddie Palmieri credits Amateur Night at the Apollo as his professional launching pad. He went there with a small Latin jazz group, a quintet. They didn't win Amateur Night. They were like one of the runners-up, and he said, "We won a wallet." But that's where he went for his start. When people talk about it as the premier black stage, absolutely it was. But what is the definition of blackness here? It's a diasporic blackness, and Cuba plays a center of that. Also, if we think about the Machito Orchestra in the 1940s, publicly announcing pride in their African heritage, that is something quite revolutionary that many of the African Americans in Harlem were just starting to grapple with. As the Congress for Racial Equality was just getting started and the Civil Rights Movement was really getting started, they were central in pushing forth pride in this identity. I want to play just one of their theme songs for a while called Tanga, but I want you to listen very carefully right at the beginning of this song.
Tanga, buroboya.
That's what I want you to hear. Back again, listen carefully.
Tanga, buroboya.
That's not Spanish. That's Yoruba, and that's a praise in Santeria to the deities, or a greeting. From the 1940s, Machito was acknowledging those roots. Beyonce is just doing the same. And from that, and most people in that audience would not know what those words meant at the beginning of that song. Tanga, by the way, means marijuana in, they say, in a West African language. We don't know which one it is, maybe Yoruba. And then if we listen after that, there's very little lyrics in this. It's basically Machito is going, but for the most part, you hear this connection with Afro-Cuban rhythms and jazz. So a lot of soloing over these grooves. So it's the blues on top of the Cuban rhythm. Machito was on the forefront of the mambo dance craze, which would be the next dance craze that comes along after the conga, and then the cha-cha would follow. Again and again, we get these reiterations of popular dances coming from Cuba. How people are moving, how people are using their bodies to interact on the dance floor. We continue into the jazz world, and we get Dizzy Gillespie and Chano Pozo. Dizzy Gillespie, one of the biggest jazz stars, innovating with a very important percussionist in Cuba to create different amalgamations of the same type of thing that Machito was using. So why do I bring these various folks up in this talk about current trends? This is the groundwork that was laid for what would emerge and finally be realized in in the late 20th century and early 21st centuries, and why Cuba has become so centered. I teach a class at Columbia University as a Caribbean music, Introduction to Caribbean Music. It's a large lecture. It's the biggest lecture class in the history of Columbia University. It has over 400 students in it. And what I do is I make them to go out and see music and write about concert reports, interview musicians, talk about their experiences. When I first started teaching this class about 20 years ago, 22 years ago, the students would go out and hear salsa bands. There were so many of them performing. They would hear Haitian compa bands. They would hear Jamaican reggae bands and be able to write in a wide range of types of practices. What they didn't hear were Cuban bands. There were very few Cuban bands playing. It wasn't until fairly recently, after the Buena Vista Social Club, another iteration of a discovery of otherness that shows up at Carnegie Hall, where we start to see a transformation once again of Cuban styles and Cuban performances. This semester, as my students were writing, when they went to find various Caribbean music, every night of the week, they could find Cuban music played in New York City. Once or twice a month, they could find Jamaican music. Rarely could they find Haitian music. The Caribbean music that is played the most, it's not Puerto Rican salsa either. Once a week to find those salsa bands playing that were so active before, but it's Cuban music. Oftentimes in small son groups playing at restaurants very near here in this neighborhood. When we think about the history of jazz and how all of this is related, to sum all of this up, oftentimes we think of a tree with branches and roots. This was painted by Herbie Mann. It's the Latin jazz family of tree as seen by Herbie Mann. If you look closer up on the screen, you probably can't see that in this room unless you have amazing eyes. You'll see Pacheco and Eddie Palmieri and Charlie Fajardo, but you'll see Billy Taylor and Tito Puente. Now you won't see anything. And you'll see, but it'll come back, I promise you. And you'll see Bossa Nova and Samba and Brazil. But the thing is then you just have one trunk and you have Spain, Africa, and Portugal. That's Herbie Mann's perspective of this. And this is quite flawed, but we oftentimes see these manifestations of interrelatedness. But I think there's something much more interesting going on in the history of music. I wouldn't create a Latin jazz tree. I wouldn't even create a jazz tree, but I would create a musical tree of the US, of the world. And it looks more like this. It looks like an aspen forest. And what's remarkable about an aspen forest is its root system. When you see an aspen forest, you will see miles and miles of trees, but it is only one organism because all of the roots are connected. Beyonce is connected to Machito, is connected to Chano Pozo, is connected to Mario Bauza, is connected to Don Aspiaso, is connected to the original Dixieland Jazz Band. And she even flashes you a New Orleans funeral band walking behind her out of the blue. Why? To pay tribute to New Orleans as the centrality, the central node from which this aspen forest grows in the United States. Now I think you're going to hear about some more recent trends in Cuban music. Thank you.
We will now hear from Ben Lapidus.
Okay, it's sort of hard to tell who can see me and who can't looking at the screen, so I apologize if you can't see my face completely. And I promise I'm going to be talking about current trends in Cuban music, but I was hoping to that you'll indulge me for one moment, since today is actually Holocaust Remembrance Day. I'd like to share a couple of brief images from a 1939 newsreel of the St. Louis, which was a ship that sailed from Hamburg, Germany to Havana and was ultimately turned away. When they first got to Cuba, there was sort of anti-Semitic sentiment in Havana. There was an anti-Semitic rally on May 8th of 1939. The thought was that Jewish refugees would bring communism and steal Cuban jobs, something that we hear to this day, that could be applied to any group. And I'm bringing this up because I think it's pertinent for where we are in the world history right now. Only 28 of the 937 passengers were allowed to stay in Cuba. One man tried to commit suicide and jumped overboard, but was allowed to recover and also stay in Cuba. The rest were sent back to Antwerp, but ultimately 254 passengers met their deaths in concentration camps. So just something to consider briefly as we embark on this discussion.
900 wandering Jews have found a haven at last. They crossed from Hamburg to Cuba, but in Havana they were refused entry and had to return to Europe and possibly to Hamburg, the city they dreaded. In every harbor, friends come out to give them words of cheer and sympathy, while they appeal by radio to the democracies. Eventually they're allowed to land in Holland, when some will go to Belgium and France, and others to England. So at last the wanderers find rest in lands which cherish freedom.
So, back to Cuban music. The first thing to say unequivocally about Cuban music today is that it is alive and well and thriving. To say otherwise would be an abject lie. And while there are lots of new developments in Cuban music concerning popular taste and popular culture, there's most definitely a continuation with a lot of the ideas that Chris was talking about, a connection and even a dialogue, I would say, with the past, the present, and the future. So we honestly don't have enough time to talk about every single development, but I want to point out a few things I think will hopefully stimulate a good discussion and perhaps good future event planning. And the first thing, ironically, to talk about is technology, because we've been suffering at the hands of technology this evening. At all stages of Cuban music has always discussed current events and also technology and its use within Cuba. Cuban composers and musicians have used creative means to describe and use technology. Let's consider the classic bolero by Eusebio Delfín Figueroa, which is called Y Tú Que Has Hecho, classic bolero. It was first recorded in 1925. The narrative talks about a girl who has carved her name into a tree trunk. The tree gives the girl one of its flowers, but she has only wounded him and forgotten him. There are many more examples like this, but I think this is the classic thing. And think about this carving into trees. Chris talked about trees, carving your name in a tree, what it means. So think about that. The earliest way to show somebody that you love them was by carving your name into a tree. And here, in this current era that we're living in, we're having some technology issues right here. Okay. In the current era of Facebook, flash memories, WhatsApp, YouTube. We have different recourses. We don't carve our names into trees for the most part. Since the worldwide advent of advanced computer technology and wide-ranging levels of access to that technology in Cuba, many artists have incorporated these same timeless ideas of ¿Y tú qué has hecho?, while updating them for today's world. Alexander Abreu, Se te olvidó quién soy yo, is telling his former love that tú no existes para mí, grábate eso en la memoria. You don't exist, record or save that in your memory. Is he talking about the flash drive memory? Is he talking about the computer memory? Is he talking about the human memory? It's not sure. But later on in the same song, he says, no sé qué virus te borró la memoria. I don't know what virus wiped your memory clean. And then he later says, to tell you what era it's from, te voy a mandar un CD con una dedicatoria. I'm going to send you a CD with a dedication. So I have a new CD coming out in a couple of weeks, and everybody that I tried to give it to tells me they don't have CD players. So they say, just tell me the Spotify link, and I can relate, because we now, it's like Eusebio Delfin talking about carving into the tree. Sending somebody a CD is about the same. This is what it sounds like.
A ti se te olvidó quién soy yo, no sé qué virus te borró la memoria, pero la vida es una sola y no repite las historias. ¿Qué importa? Con su gusto se muere, la muerte le sabe a gloria. Te voy a mandar un CD con una dedicatoria.
Tanto tiempo machacándome la vida, pensando que me querías. Fue ese tiempo que más pudo el interés que el amor que me tenías. ¿Qué importa? Que por su gusto se muere, la muerte le sabe a gloria. Tú no existes para mí, grábate eso en la memoria.
A ti se te olvidó quién soy yo, no sé qué virus te borró la memoria.
No sé qué virus te borró
pero
la
vida es
memoria.
una sola y no repite las historias. ¿Qué importa?
No importa
Su
nada.
gusto se muere, la muerte le sabe a gloria. Te voy a mandar un CD con una dedicatoria.
Vaya, camina por arriba, hermano.
And even newer technology like the DVD gets some play in Cuban music. And because memorias or flash drives have really played a crucial role in distribution for music and information, right? El paquete in Cuban society. There's another song that came out approximately 2 years after this called Esa Soy Yo, which is a real kind of pro-woman song where the singer tells her husband she's going to run things in the house, but she's going to still bring him the DVD.
Soy yo, la que manda en la casa. Soy yo, la que trajo el DVD. Soy yo, la que cocina como camina. Soy yo, y tú te comes mi rapa. Soy yo, la que tiene la llave.
Okay. The increasing importance of social media is also reflected in Cuban music today. Emilio Frias, El Niño y La Verdad, pleads with a female fan not to post a selfie of him on social media. No me la publiques. Esto es para los dos. Don't publish this picture. Don't put it up on the social media. This is just for the two of us. And Alain Perez also tells his love interest in one of his songs. I don't care how many followers that you have on Instagram. And in another Alain Perez song, he says that he's going to put his life now into modo avión, which means airplane mode. So we can see how technology has really, become baked into contemporary song. And finally, Facebook Messenger and WhatsApp are still relevant for communicating within Cuba and from between Cuba and beyond Cuba. And in another song I want to play for you, have a singer named Lázaro Borrego, who tells his ex-lover basically, like, if you want to get in touch with me, you can send me a message in a chat or you can send me Messenger, but don't call me. So here's El Niño talking about the don't publish the photo.
Dale tu dedo, Kenchi, y avisa a Dairo. No me la publiques, ey, no me la publiques, mamá, esa solo es para vos. No me la publiques, esa es para los dos. Y si tu marido es celoso, por favor ten un control. No me la publiques.
first, this is Mola Avión, great song.
Ahora subí, subí, volé y volé, ya desconecté y estoy en modo avión. Ya desconecté, todo se acabó y ahora me la paso en otro vacilón. Subí, subí, volé y volé, ya desconecté y estoy en modo avión. Y ando por la dura, con tremenda sabrosura, sin cobertura. Subí, subí, volé y volé, ya desconecté y estoy en modo avión. Y estoy quitado, desconectado, buscando un ritmo en otro lado. Subí, subí, volé, ya desconecté y estoy en modo avión. Voy partiendo, voy bajando como amiga, gozando. Volando voy, volando vengo. Señoras y señores pasajeros con el destino a la isla Vacilón, háganme favor y a votar. Que se va, y me quedé sin batería, se me fue la conexión. Ya desconecté y estoy en modo avión.
Here's Lázaro Borrego with telling his ex to communicate only with Messenger or WhatsApp.
No, ni te va. No me llames más. Si no es por Messenger, por WhatsApp. No me llames más. Oye, sigue retomando.
Si no por Messenger, por WhatsApp. Easier access to modern recording technology, Wi-Fi, and platforms for sharing large files has facilitated the collaboration between artists based in Cuba and beyond. This is apparent in so many recent recordings that it would take too much time to list them all. The most famous ones being Patria Vida, which had collaborators both in Cuba and in Miami. And of course, I think of Willie Chirino and Leonie Torres doing that Father's Day song before Leonie came to Miami. And of course, this next video, which I think is absolutely fascinating because it's one of many collaborations this band has done. This is Timba Live, which is based in Miami. And the thing that's fascinating here is half of this video was filmed in Havana, half of the video was filmed in Miami. And then throughout the last part of the video, they just keep doing cut shots, going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So the song ends, people are kind of having a good time, and there's a rumba, and you see the rumba happening in El Solar in La Habana, and you see the rumba happening in El Solar, if you can call it that, in Miami.
Caballero sin maldad. Tiene bururu y vara. No pasa nada. Tiene bururu y vara. No pasa nada. Tiene bururu y vara. Oye, sin maldad. Tiene bururu y
Again, this is fascinating. It was recorded in, I don't know the precise logistics of recording, if Maito Rivera was actually in Miami or he recorded his part in Havana and sent it to Miami, but the idea that you would shoot the video to show that it's kind of one long connected thing is pretty bold and fascinating. In the embrace of YouTube, Twitter, and other digital platforms has also brought about some direct musical and non-musical exchanges between artists in Cuba and those beyond Cuba. And there's no doubt the rise in access to technology has gone hand in hand with the establishment of social groups among young people, such as los miquis and los repas, or people who are interested in la música de reparto, the urban music. Another really fascinating thing that's happening today in this time period is that some of the stuff that Chris was talking about is even more overt than it ever was in terms of the representations of religious Afro-Cuban religious music and Afro-Cuban secular music in terms of the media surrounding music. We can look at this changing from colonial times to the present and increasing, but there's some great examples right now, and I think the ones that I want to show you right now they really speak for themselves, but I'll give you a very quick introduction. The first one is, again, El Niño y la Verdad, Emilio Frias, who's an Abacua, Palero, Santero, a very beloved singer, an incredible singer, to be honest. And this video that he has is basically showing, is talking about Ifa, the Bawalaos in La Regla de Ocha. This is before the music even starts in the video. They have this video showing a bunch of Bawalaos sitting around eating, talking, and I think this is pretty incredible.
Apete bi un belondo, apete bi un beloda, apeye se ifa, apete bi mafu. Apeye se ifa ni la ye, apete bi mafu. Apeye se ifa ni la ye, apete bi fa. Apeye se ifa ni la ye, apete bi mafu. Orumila minika choncho lo weri atifa wa. Ifa ni la ye, apete bi mafu. Apeye se ifa ni la ye, apete bi mafu. These
are all notable musicians: Lázaro Valdés, Oderki Serebe, Alexander Abreu. This is the cream of the crop of Cuban musicians who are also Bawalaos. So this is a dance song, but in the beginning of the song, in the beginning of the video, going out of their way to show the connections on many levels to these religious traditions. Here is another song similarly. This is a, let me see what this is. Okay, this is a song by Dayan Carrera with El Hijo de Teresa, and this is also a brilliant song because it also includes a lot of liturgical stuff from the Orisha tradition here. They're going to be singing for Ochun in a popular song. This is also not something that's new. It's been happening for a long time, but just the fact that it's so out front and it's so much the focus of the music is really quite incredible when one considers that it wasn't really until 1991 that any religious practice could be practiced out in the open for anyone. If you were Orisha practitioner, if you were Jewish, if you were Catholic, there were serious implications if you were outwardly practicing these systems, religious systems, and now this is the mainstream culture in the media, at least.
Más linda, mire ese cuerpo, mire esa cara. La misa ya va a empezar. Los negros con su bumbum se paran frente al altar, sacan su collar de Ochun. Achita por tu madre que te hace candela. Esa sí chunte, linda es usted, es usted, es usted, es usted. Soromandio, anda y robo,
This next piece came out, I think, at one of the most intense moments in the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a piece, Asoano, which refers to San Lázaro or Babalu Aye, and again in the Lukumi Yoruba Orisha tradition that comes from Yoruba peoples in Cuba. And you'll notice, obviously, the purple shirts for San Lázaro, but you'll also see what's cool about this, musically speaking, is not only are they using musical ideas from the Lukumi tradition, but also from Palo, from the Congolese religious strands. And you'll also see people kind of crawling on the ground, like as if they're doing promesas for San Lázaro. This is also fascinating on so many levels.
Los perros le acompañaron en su larga travesía. Pico Verde. Arriba, mundo. Salamale, male, sala. Salamale, male, male. Salamale, male, sala. Salamale, bajo los cojos. Salamale, male, sala. Carretonero, male, sala. Salamale, male, sala. Llenero, que lo cure. Salamale, male, oh yeah. Male, sala. Salamale, barrio, agua. Salamale, male, sala. Ahora de primera, ¿qué fue? Salamale, male, sala. Salamale, male, male. Salamale, sí, soy yo, otra vez. Tu pasadía. Salamale, male, sala. Los perros.
Okay. There's a pretty strong, if not straight line between Ignacio Piñeros Mayella No Juega con los Santos from the 1920s to Benny Moré singing Siguaraya in the 40s and Miguelito CUNY singing Rompe Saragüey in the 1950s. All the way back, all the previously mentioned artists, including Alexander Abreu, Jaile Monpié, Maito Rivera, Alain Perez, all of these folks have also been making recordings that are sort of homenajes or homages to the past. And Alexander Abreu, this is something he's been doing, kind of paying tribute, if you will, to artists from the 1980s and 1990s, even more recently. What does it mean to succeed in Cuban music today? Well, instructions for up-and-coming singers are everywhere in today's Cuban music. Like you'll hear El Niño say, para ser cantante hay que nacer. If you want to be a singer, you have to be born a singer. Or tú no eres popular. Like you think you're popular, but you're not popular. And we can extend this music, we can also extend this whole thing to the música de reparto and Cuban hip-hop, where rappers are constantly criticizing each other's bars and flows. There's a lot of beef songs between artists, Cuban artists. It seems like every week there's a different rapper beefing with another rapper, and we're watching it all online. You can follow every move, and people are engaging with the artists directly in the comment section. Somebody puts out a song like La Seri La Niña or El Micha or Chocolate MC, and then in the comment section online, you can watch they're getting skewered or they're getting their props. It's really fascinating. This didn't used to happen. So the present, most Cuban artists continue to speak about present-day conditions in Cuba. Some have overt political messages, some without. But again, I think there's a real connecting through line in Cuban music that extends, say, from old bamban songs to NG La Banda, La Bruja, Charanga Habaneras, Hagamos un Chain, La Turista de Buena Vista, all the way to Charanga Habanera and El Chacal, Gozando en La Habana, which is a popular song from 2012, Pasaporte, Alain Perez, Me Quedé Sin Luz y Sin Agua, El Niño El Cambio, and of course, this whole phenomenon of Black Lives Matter and what's happening in the United States is also something that Cuban artists have been trying to address. This is a great track that came out not too long ago with Osmel Diaz Baloy and El Funky, El Faraón, and Michael Sorbo. But it mentions George Floyd and Black Lives Matter.
Se discrimina y el racista camina por un puente hecho por neuronas cretinas que se empecinan en querer mucho más de lo que miran, negro en la mira. El amo come del esfuerzo del esclavo y el esclavo del esfuerzo de sus propias manos. Estoy seguro que con estos argumentos yo no gano. Soy negro, pero antes de todo soy humano. Y me pregunto lo que no te has preguntado. Generalizado por mi raza, envidiado por la masa. Cuando conseguimos una buena posición, vivimos en buena casa. Tenemos un alto nivel cultural, pero hay quien se molesta viendo negros progresar. Es algo lógico que el sol salga para todos, pero a todos no ilumine por igual.
Negro es el color, negro el pensamiento, negro es el dolor, negro el sufrimiento, negro el ADN que heredé de mis ancestros. Lo que no tiene colores es valor y el sentimiento. Negro es el color, negro el pensamiento, negro es el dolor, negro el sufrimiento, negro el ADN que heredé de mis ancestros. Lo que no tiene colores es valor y el sentimiento.
What doesn't have color is value and feelings, right? El valor ni sentimiento. Powerful statement. Other contemporary issues that have come up, especially in the time of the pandemic, of course, there were a number of COVID-19 songs. This one was actually controversial because El Tosco, que descanse en paz, José Luis Cortés, made a gesture that's considered an Asian slur, and but the song was popular and tried to make light of, if you will, of the coronavirus, if one could make light of it.
Ahí lo cogió el coronavirus y no lo salvó ni el médico chino. Él tenía un resfriado, pensaba que eso era un juego, y cuando lo descubrió ya no tenía remedio. A él lo cogió el coronavirus.
Now there's still a debate. Do we call it timba? Do we call it Cuban popular dance music? What do we call it? And then this 2019 interview with Amaury Perez on the TV show Con Dos Que Se Quieran, Alexander Abreu defined timba as follows. Timba is simply a mix between pop, jazz, and Cuban music. Either all these beats, pop music, is mixed with the clave, and jazz is used to sort of complicate the harmonic cycles. In other words, a complication enters that becomes more aggressive. It makes the music more aggressive. And then we add popular slang to this, maybe how we speak in Cuba. And as I know, everything that has to do with our local language. And he says that's what timba is. But let's hear him say that in his own words.
La timba es simplemente una mezcla entre pop, jazz y la música cubana. O sea, todos estos beats de la música pop se mezclan con la clave y el jazz complica los ciclos armónicos, complica, o sea, entra una complicación que se hace un producto más agresivo. A esto le agregas el argot popular, o sea, cómo se habla en Cuba, todo lo que tiene que ver con nuestro idioma local.
Sí, sí. Sí, porque hay un hablar cubano.
Y bueno, sale lo que es la timba. Realmente parecen dos cosas distintas, pero cuando vienes a ver, todo tiene la misma base.
Sí, y además el mismo fin, que es hacer bailar a la gente, ¿no? O sea, no ha complicado, en tu experiencia, tú tienes músicos, yo conozco a tu orquesta muy bien, por supuesto, y han tocado conmigo muchos de ellos, pero tú sientes que porque tú complejices la estructura armónica, musical, la gente baila menos o no?
Depende.
This is a good part of the interview. I have to skip over it, but he talks about the necessity of keeping the music simple, and that's why something like Cuban son is so popular, because sometimes when you try to make things complicated, sometimes it appeals to people, sometimes it doesn't. You can find this on YouTube. It's a great interview. And a great example of him, outright taking jazz. He just did this record about a year ago with called what is it called? Que todo se acabó. It's a playing homage to the music of the 1980s and 90s that he grew up with and that he played. And here he is. I'm going to play this for you. This is Oleo as written and performed by Sonny Rollins because he puts it straight into his music. I'm going to show you how. If we look back to recordings from 1959, such as Arsenio Rodriguez's tune El Divorcio and Juanito Marquez's 1972 album Marquez, we can hear the use of specific elements, particularly the bass, moving in a way that's going to signal forthcoming changes in Cuban popular music for many, many years to come. I'm going to show this to you really quickly. In the breakdown or the bote section of songs like Charanga Habanera's Lola Lola, or Michael Blanco's Te Escapaste, El Niño La Verdad's Música Suave, I'm going to show you how this all connects back to the music of the 1950s, but in a way that we're showing this influence of North American music, hip-hop, funk, R&B. It's had a lasting influence on Cuban popular music, but it has also become its own thing. It's been transformed into something new. So here is Arsenio, El Divorcio. Check out what the tres right here and the bass are doing. It basically goes boom, 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 boom. Right? It's what you might consider to be proto timba, if you will. Now, to further make my case, I've slowed it down 50%. Here is La Candela, 1973, Bamban. La Candela, La Candela, La Candela, La Candela. Aquí se enciende la candela, aquí se baila como... 1998.
Que Lola estaba tan dura, pero tan dura, que tú no podías con ella. Que Lola no era Mireia.
Lola, Lola, tú estás muy buena, punto de bola.
Oye, Lola está, como dicen los viejos, pa' comer y pa' llevar. ¿Oíste?
Just listen to the bass. Same musical idea.
¿Tú sabes quién es ese? Arréate. ¿Tú sabes quién es ese? A ese le dicen la bestia. ¿La qué? La bestia. ¿La qué? La bestia. ¿Pero de qué? Del bajo será. La bestia. Aplausos, señores, aplausos, aplausos para Alfonso. La bestia.
And this just came out during the 2022. Same concept.
Y eso no cabe. Oye, que tú eres música suave. Bueno, mira, ya todo el mundo te conoce y todo el mundo lo sabe. Que tú eres música suave, papá. Lo sabe, que tú eres música suave.
So there we have at least 1959 to 1922, same concept happening in the bass. I'm sure there's examples that precede Arsenio Rodriguez, but that's the earliest one that I can find. And to conclude, while some Cuban musicians continue to move forward back and forth between Cuba, the United States, and elsewhere, Cuban music has definitely increased exposure and is now diffused throughout the world by a variety of digital platforms, streaming services, social media, radio, and other media. As a direct result of this coverage, there has been a notable increase in a kind of musical call and response between Cubans on the island and beyond, in the form of songs being directed at specific artists, people, events, or institutions. The music videos, and commentaries that have come from these exchanges definitely seem to have a greater presence than in the past due to this new digital age that we're living in. Today's fans of Cuban music can know the details of Chocolate MC's comings and goings, what La Diosa and her family are up to besides her music, the latest tiradera between artists in the música reparto scene or in the Cuban hip-hop scene, as well as which artists have left Cuba, returned to Cuba, and what their latest musical activities are. Today's fan of Cuban music can also watch snippets of concerts and even view some concerts in their entirety on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter, whether transmitted from the provinces of Cuba, La Habana, Miami, or anywhere else in the world. Prior to the advent of these technologies, it was all Radio Bemba, or word of mouth. So in many ways, this change is a win-win situation for Cuban music. These platforms also allow for better communication among Cuban musicians and musicians who play Cuban music around the world. These digital platforms facilitate collaborations and the sharing of musical knowledge, particularly older archival recordings of Cuban music that are not easily accessible in Cuba. And this is not limited to Cuban sacred music. Musical groups dedicated to older folkloric and regional styles of music, such as changui, are also using these platforms and gaining visibility within Cuba and beyond. Folkloric and religious music is also taught using WhatsApp and other venues. This was unthinkable not too long ago. Given these factors, the future of Cuban music is bright and dynamic as it continues to thrive, while simultaneously connecting and reconnecting the past with the present. And I'm going to end with a little clip which I watched myself about maybe 6-8 days ago, which is a live transmission from Guantánamo, Cuba. La Loma de Chivo is La Casa de Changui, and they put up this great band, Mikiki and Roberto Duvergé playing bongo. And this was just Facebook. This was not YouTube. Oh, there we go. Getting there. So that's a straight-on camera shot of the stage. If you were to sit, let's say this is La Casa de Changui, La Loma de Chivo, and that's the stage you're sitting exactly. This is what it would be like. It's not a 5-camera shoot. There's nothing glamorous about it. But if you're a fan of the music, it's absolutely amazing. It's much easier than taking a few airplanes and buses and all the other concomitant necessities of traveling to Guantanamo. So that's a win-win, I think. So thank you very much.
Just a couple more minutes of thank yous. I think I may piggyback on you.
Yeah, sure.
You're still up?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. This was an experiment. We learned a lot. We had 2 universities cooperating, and obviously Ben from John Jay, Chris from Columbia, Chris Washburne from Columbia, and who should join us? Oh, you did. Okay. And I want to thank all of you who've been both the people who've linked in virtually, as well as the people who are in this room, for your patience, etc. As I said, when you have 2 musicians and a historian, you don't always get the best in technology. But I think we did a good job in terms of the richness of the 2 presentations by Ben and Chris. And I want to thank John Jay in particular for being so hospitable, etc. Remy Bahati, who tried to do everything, etc. And also Astrid Lieden, who's up at Columbia doing the webinar technology. And obviously, there's a special thank you to all of you who made the trip to John Jay, even if you were already in the building, or if you had, I saw a few people that came all the way down from Columbia University. Amazing, amazing. And even City College, etc. So we look forward to seeing you again, maybe at a nightclub or jazz club that our experts can recommend. Thank you all for coming, and good night.